Hey Deckers, today I'm going to have a look at 5 games that were either broken or unplayable on release and answer the question of is it playable now? So let's have a look at these games, starting off with Monster Hunter Wilds. Officially unsupported on the Steam Deck, but still pulling around 35,000 active players a day. Not a great look out of the box on the Steam Deck. It does look absolutely hideous. Not sure what they were aiming for with these minimum settings, but it is extremely fuzzy. Minimum settings and a 30 frames per second cap is pretty much what you're going to go for. And with AMD FSR or XeSS, it still doesn't look great. Even if you try and push FSR on ultra performance, you don't really gain much for it looking absolutely terrible. In the town area, it's still pretty bad moving around. And with the in-game frame generation, it doesn't help at all. So we use the lossless scaling Decky plugin here. We do push up to the 40 frames per second mark. Most of the time you can actually make this playable when you leave the town area. That lossless scaling, it does work quite nicely. I just can't get over how bad this looks. So verdict on this one of is it playable now is no in my book, because it just looks absolutely horrible. But if you can put up with the graphics, then performance wise with the lossless scaling from Decky, then technically it is playable. I just can't deal with this level of low graphics. So let us know in the comments below if you're going to be playing or trying Monster Hunter Wilds again on deck. Next up is Borderlands 4, and still with the basic settings, officially unsupported because it is a terrible experience out of the box, especially when you're in the outer world. Doesn't feel too bad moving around, but as soon as we enter that combat, we're down into the low 20s on the frames per second, and even lower quite a lot of the time. So even with the lowest graphic settings, pretty much not happening on this one out of the box. But if we turn on the lossless scaling mod, it does just about make it playable in my book. It does feel a little bit better. There isn't really any input latency that's noticeable. And now with the lossless scaling, we do push up to that 40 to 50 range most of the time. And in battles, it barely drops down below that 40. So it does feel a bit more normal. Graphics wise, it doesn't look absolutely terrible. So it definitely looks and feels a lot better than the standard settings without lossless scaling. So it definitely feels a lot better moving around with that lossless scaling. So as long as you keep that on, verdict on this one is yes, it is playable now, but only if you use lossless scaling. Avatar Frontiers of Pandora up next, and still officially unsupported. You may have noticed that all of these are also available on GeForce Now so far. Lowest graphics settings on this one, and it is a terrible experience out of the box, so definitely supporting that unsupported status, as even standing still we're barely getting 20 frames per second, not even hitting it most of the time, with sub 10 frames per second on quite a few occasions as well. And it's not as if it doesn't even feel laggy moving around, it feels really laggy, and once we get up and flying, that stutter becomes extremely noticeable, and there is that minor amount of input latency as well. Avatar does support the in-game frame generation, though this just actually makes things even worse whether you use the XeSS or the FSR version. On the Steam Deck, it just can't handle it. With the frame generation on, frames per second don't really change, but the input latency and the stutter moving around is definitely far more noticeable. So no real gain using frame generation, at least in-game on this one. And if we turn that frame generation in-game off and use the Decky lossless frame gen instead, although the frames per second do look better, no real input latency, but once again, it's not giving a great buffer of frames. And although it's showing 30 frames per second, moving around, it really doesn't feel like it. And as you actually start moving around the map in faster time, you get massive lag spikes and huge stutter moving around. So verdict on this one, is it playable now? Is a definite no. Even with lossless scaling or any of the other plugins, it's still not working, as we could expect on the deck. CarX Street up next, and this does have officially playable status now, and around the same amount of players, if not more, than Avatar, but is not available on GeForce Now. So fortunately, if you come off of the medium graphic settings, which does launch with, and it looks absolutely horrendous, because it stutters around 10 frames per second. Once you put it down to low, and if you change those settings in game, by the way, it will crash and you'll have to restart. But once you're actually on those low graphics settings, if you do it from the main menu, it's fine. Same with changing the anti-aliasing quality. We can actually run this with the low quality preset, but anti-aliasing on quality or even completely off with the textures on medium and get a pretty decent 60 frames per second for the most part. If you have that TAA on quality mode, it actually stays above 60 to 80 very happily, but if you want to just get a slightly better looking image with occasional dips into the 40s, then you can turn up those graphics a little bit more and have an absolute blast on CarX Street. So is it playable now? Yes, it definitely is. And if you do want to tweak those graphics just a little bit more to get a bit more out of it, as you can see with the medium shadows as well, we're getting some nice sun effects, then you can enable that lossless scaling just to get the extra edge on it with those extra graphics. But you don't need lossless scaling on this one if you just want to have a good time and not worry about any input latency or extra plugins. Rounding out our list then is Doom: The Dark Ages, officially verified on the Steam Deck now, and I can see why, as with the slight tweak of the settings, with the low turning VSync off, with the film grain off as well, the upscaling on XeSS on quality mode, we can actually run this on ultra quality with XeSS, motion blur off, and otherwise the handheld default graphic settings, we actually get a pretty decent 30 to 40 frames per second with it looking absolutely gorgeous on the deck. Even when we're flying around on the dragon and having some funky fights by hand, it does dip very slightly, very close and dangerously under that 30 frames per second with these settings, but it is definitely more than playable. Not quite sure it deserves verified, as it does need a little bit of a tweak, but if we do also turn on that decky frame gen with these settings, things become exceptionally smooth. And I was even able to take down some of the bosses without much of a problem, apart from my standard of trying to get used to playing games as I switch between testing. As you can see, pushing 60 frames per second for the most part once the decky frame gen's on, keeping the original settings that I showed here, and even higher when we're out flying around on the dragon. So verdict on this one of is it playable now? Yes, it definitely is. You can get by without lossless scaling, but lossless scaling definitely makes things a lot more comfortable in this one. And obviously once you get to your recommended settings, just turn off the FPS overlay so that you can just have a good time. Let us know in the comments below if you're diving back into any of these titles or what other titles you'd like us to have a look at to see if it's playable now. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.